Thank you. Today I'm going to talk about an Irradiance uniformity mapping module that we constructed at CFV Labs. We've done some initial testing, have some what I think are pretty interesting results to share so far. So for a basic talk outline, I'm going to have a basic introduction. I'm going to cover some of the instrument design and construction. We're going to move on to calibration, which I think, at least for me, was probably one of the most interesting parts of this whole project. So I'm going to cover it pretty quickly. If you have more specific questions or detailed questions, I'd be happy to talk about those. Then we're going to move on to talking about some indoor applications. This is kind of where we started with this piece of instrumentation. It's kind of evolved in what we intended to use it for. Then I'll move on to some outdoor applications and then a summary. So, as everyone knows, Irradiance uniformity is an important driver of PV performance. For modeling, at least outdoors, and in some cases maybe indoors, this is often assumed to be uniform in the cases of, for example, front side plane of array irradiance. But in other cases where it's known not to be uniform, this is something that's oftentimes calculated, but maybe not directly measured at the level that we want to. Regarding indoor measurements, this is also a significant driver of solar simulator measurement uncertainty. So we have basically a test plane, module in a test plane, and the non-uniformity of that test plane is a significant driver of the actual uncertainty bounds on the STC measurements themselves. And as many of you probably could guess, if you can't measure the baseline case in a lab at standard test conditions accurately, everything else is harder than that, really. And so the original incarnation of this project was basically to tune our flash uncertainties to as low as we could possibly get them, because that's an important kind of feedback into the modeling aspect. One way to classify uniformity or also non-uniformity is through the equation shown here. This is just basically from the IC 60904 standard. And this is a metric to classify the non-uniformity of a radiance incident on some plane. So this is used for solar simulator classification. You can also use a metric to characterize the overall uniformity in any other environment. So for us, because this is an important parameter, we naturally wanted to ask the question, can we measure this uniformity in 2 dimensions quickly and accurately? And those are both pretty important drivers here. So basically what we did is we took a 1x2 meter form factor modules. This is pretty standard, like 72 cell module. It has 60 individual cells, and the cells are tabbed out through the back sheet. And behind each cell, we install a custom data acquisition board that CFV Labs designed, built, and calibrated themselves. And this is set up to measure cell ISC for each cell individually. The really cool thing here is that all of these are connected via an RS-485 network. So we actually have one power connection, one data connection in and out. So that's basically all we have. So other incarnations, as I've seen, have a lot of wires come off the back and make it kind of difficult to install in a variety of applications or installations. Additionally, it has a very simple interface, just using PyModbus. So everything here is basically Python analysis, including the data acquisition. And we have 2 main measurement modes. So we have a slow mode, which is for constant irradiance environments, and we have a high-speed mode, which allows us to have time-resolved measurements of fast, which is less than 35 millisecond flash pulses. And we can, during that pulse, measure 256 samples. So for us, this is really important. Regarding calibration for the module, there's 2 primary functions here. The first one is an overall, what I would call an absolute calibration, which is a translation of ADU or raw values off the DAC boards themselves to a physical unit such as watt per meter squared. So that's one component of this. And the other one is cell to cell. So if you want to actually resolve differences in some uniformity in a test plane or in the flasher, if that calibration itself is bad, you don't have the resolution to be able to do that. So as part of the calibration process, we tried a bunch of different methods. So I'm going to kind of just very quickly go through a few of these. The 3 top ones were all done indoors. So we had a couple methods. One was we would take a single cell and move it around our test plane at the positions of the cells in the module. So we'd measure the module and then these single positions and then use that to back out the actual calibration values for the module. That's time consuming. So this is one of the problems. We have another method where we take the module, we shift it in X and Y positions. So we sample the irradiance plane, or the inherent irradiance distribution, with the cells, different cells at the same point, and then we simultaneously solve for both the intrinsic field and the calibration values. Again, it's a little less time consuming, but time consuming. For simple calibration for use outdoors, you can just put it in. Our solar simulator is pretty uniform, so we just assume it's uniform and derive the values from that. And then there's an outdoor method where we use natural sunlight, assuming also that it's uniform. So there's some kind of circular arguments here a little bit. I'd be happy to talk about this in more detail for anyone that's interested. The calibration so far has been a very fundamentally challenging part of this project. The indoor methods have some advantages. It's in a temperature controlled environment. The flashes themselves do not, we don't have any issue with current shunt heating for the current shunts that are installed on the boards themselves, but they're time consuming to do indoors. The outdoor methods are a little bit faster because you can install it one time and then derive the calibration values comparing to another irradiance reference, assuming that the irradiance uniformity is perfect. But one problem is that this all is at temperature, and the input irradiance may not be perfectly uniform. There may be ground bounce and albedo effects and things like that. So on the right here, I just show two relative calibration maps from cell to cell between two of the different methods, one outdoor, one indoor. So you can see that they agree pretty well. There are some subtle differences here. So moving on to some of the indoor applications, I know this is not really a modeling thing, it's more of an instrumentation and testing perspective. The standard method in 60904 is to take a single cell and move around the test plane, and then essentially it's one flash per measurement. It's a very slow process. The more points you do, the worse it gets. And so because it's a flat one measurement per flash, there's a few instances in which we can't use that method adequately. And those are basically in the flash to flash. So we want to know, does the uniformity change from one pulse to another? If I can only sample one point each time, can't access that information. And the intra-flash, which is during a flash. I don't know that doesn't change. It's an interesting thing that we wanted to understand. And then also time resolved continuous illumination environments. So that might be outdoors, it could be indoors, depending on the simulator. So on the right, this is a typical standard uniformity map of our flasher measured indoors using the single cell method. So again, as I said, to measure these other regimes, we have to have another method for this. So the first thing that we did was evaluate how consistent is the uniformity during a flash. So shown on the screen here, it's just some standard flash properties. This is 1,000 watt per meter squared. It's a 35 millisecond duration with a 25 millisecond window. And we tested these delays from basically flash pulse to start here from 5 to 12. And here's just a sample that we've shown at a 9 millisecond delay. So basically the blue is where we actually make an IV measurement. We don't make any measurement where it's gray. What we found in this heat map, you can see this is the intra-flash variation. The standard deviation of the single cell ISE values is actually better than 0.3% over this 25 millisecond window, which was higher than what we were originally expecting to see. We had suppositions that it was probably pretty good, but we just had no way to directly confirm it. And if we looked at a few of the flashes, most of these flashes themselves, the standard deviation was less than 0.2% of the absolute value. Now, one interesting thing that we did note was that the non-uniformity, as calculated by the metric that I showed earlier in the presentation, we calculate that for all of the cells. We can see that when the delay is short, there is a time evolution of the non-uniformity during the flash pulse, which was something that was interesting to us. And if you lengthen that pulse from say 12 to even 9 to 12 milliseconds, we find that variation drops to almost negligible differences. So basically the takeaway is the non-uniformity is stable during a flash if the delay between measurements is long enough. We next moved on to ask the question, how consistent is the uniformity from flash to flash? So usually we'll measure one module and then put another module in and test them. So understanding how this varies from flash to flash is an important metric for us. Also, it checks to verify that the single cell method is actually capturing the same irradiance field. In this case, I took 10 flashes, and the flash to flash standard deviation of the single cell ICs was better than 0.05%. So flash to flash, the distribution, the test plane uniformity is really, really uniform. And in this plot, this is the mean non-uniformity for the single flash, and these whisker bars here represent the standard deviation within the module, within the flash. So we can see that the standard deviation from flash to flash is actually smaller than the intra-flash variation. So this all is really, really good information for us as a test lab to drive some of our uncertainties down. Because when we do the measurements, if we have the uniformity change during the sweep, we're sampling different points of the IV curve with different uniformity. That's potentially a problem. And one thing we did observe is that there's larger variations observed at the beginning of the flash, as we saw in the earlier plot. And again, if I then move to a 12 millisecond delay, you see this all tightens up just a little bit. And so we can kind of draw the conclusion, overall, the non-uniformity is stable from flash to flash. So this is a pretty useful piece of information for us. So taking the module outdoors, we didn't originally design it to do this, but decided, hey, what the heck, we'll just move on outside with it. We installed the module in CFV's bifacial test yards. This is shown on the upper right up here. This is basically 5 30 module long rows. And we installed it on a height adjustable fixture that allows us to test most standard module clamp and height configurations within the test yard. So you can see here, this is the module installed facing downwards on the tracker torque tube. I want to put a little note here that these gaps are filled during the measurements, so we do not have this ground illumination problem while we're making the measurements. For this data set, I took measurements within plus or minus 4 hours of solar noon for roughly 2 to 3 days in each of 3 configurations. The first one is what I refer to as clamp 1, which is with a module to torque tube gap of 51 millimeters, and this was installed between piers, basically in a position kind of like here. Then we have a torque tube gap of 64, also installed between piers. And then I took the module and installed it with a slightly taller clamp or larger gap of 64 millimeters to kind of investigate whether we actually see pier-related changes, pier-induced changes in the non-uniformity on the backside. This all testing was conducted with an albedo of approximately 28% in the test yard with a GCR of about 0.37. So what's really neat here is we actually can do 2D time-resolved irradiance maps. In this case, these were measured 5 seconds apart. So this is kind of interesting to see data at this level of temporal resolution. So plot on the right here is basically solar hour from noon. So this is basically -4 to 2. And you can see the non-uniformity metric. So this is actually tracker steps. This tracker's adjusting position in a stepwise fashion in the test yard. And the non-uniformity over here, these values might look alarming initially, the 34 to 46%, but this is only the backside irradiance. It's not the overall contribution to the front side as well. And so some of the factors here, here's a heat map that influence the irradiance are the view factor, which is ground illumination, height above the ground, shading losses, torque tube, and the clamps. So moving through a couple plots here, this is basically 9:30 in the morning. You can see that at different tracker positions, the uniformity changes during the test. So this is within what most people should expect to be seen. It's really interesting to actually see it borne out in real time 2D data. So we thought this was pretty exciting. So one quick way to kind of do some diagnostics of the different measurements and the different configurations, absent any models, just to kind of check to see the effects, the type of effects that we could see, was to take a ratio of these irradiance maps themselves. So if we took a ratio of the clamp 2 data set, which was the higher clamp over between the piers, and then over clamp 1, this isolates the effect of just the module height above the torque tube. And so if I take this difference map and subtract out basically the mean values, we can actually see the increased irradiance in the cells that were directly above the torque tube. And this amount corresponds roughly to about 4.3%. So if we look along the module long dimension here, it's basically as column. And we look at different rows within the data, you can see that the average roughly is about 4.3% increase in the backside irradiance. This is just direct measurement, no modeling, no assumptions, just increasing from 51 to 64. So this is exciting for us to see that there's a direct confirmation that we can, with this instrument, resolve even roughly a 1 centimeter, a little over 1 centimeter change in that gap. This is pretty interesting to us. And if we looked at data from clamp 2 when it was installed over a pier compared to clamp 2 installed between piers just over the torque tube, we can also see the emergence of some interesting 2D structure that was sort of unexpected. I wasn't anticipating this. And so far what we see is, go back to this one. Initially, this is kind of an initial data set. We had some kind of mixed weather conditions. We've had a pretty intense monsoon season in Albuquerque. So I was trying to get data in between monsoonal weather this summer. We see a decrease just north of the pier. So if I go back just real quick, the module installed Right here, you can see the pier. It's basically behind or underneath these two cells, these two groups of cells. So we can see that the uniformity map has changed basically right on top of that pier. And so here we see roughly a 7.4% decrease of irradiance there. But then we see a very interesting and unexpected 4 to 10% increase southeast here. We don't really know the origin of this yet. It's probably some kind of reflection. So we'll be under more clear sky conditions taking some additional measurements to kind of verify this. So in summary, CFV, well, we created a two-dimensional uniformity mapping module. We did all the in-house design, construction of the boards, calibration of the instrument. The irradiance, so some of the things that we did learn, the uniformity of the irradiance of a short pulse simulator was measured to be stable in the following conditions during flash and from flash to flash. And so the initial outdoor measurements demonstrate that the instrument is sensitive enough to detect some of these small changes. One, we could do time-resolved inter-module variations of the backside irradiance. So this is something that we are very eager to move into the modeling front now and verify kind of 2D resolved backside irradiance maps, because now we can directly measure it. And then we've also demonstrated a sensitivity to different module clamping configurations and mounting locations within single access tracker. All right, thank you.